Imagine you're sitting in a car, the snow is falling heavily outside, and the driver, the son you gave birth to, raised, and sacrificed your whole life for, suddenly stops the car in the middle of a desolate mountain area with no phone, no warm coat, and tells you, "Get out." That's not a nightmare. That's the night Evelyn Mercer realized that the son she loved most was the one who wanted her dead. If you want to know what happened next and what lessons she left for the world, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because what happens afterward hurts more than you think. I used to believe that the worst kind of cold was the kind that came from the sky, the kind that settled into your bones when you weren't dressed for it, the kind that turned your breath into white clouds and made your fingers ache at the knuckles. I had spent 68 years of my life in the Northeast, and I knew that kind of cold intimately. The way it crept under the door on January mornings, the way it glazed the windshields and silenced the birds. But I was wrong. I didn't know anything about cold. Not until the night my son drove me to the edge of a mountain road, stopped the car, and told me to get out. That is the night I am going to tell you about. Not because it was the worst night of my life, though it was, but because it was also the night everything I had chosen not to see finally became impossible to ignore. And the truth, when it hit me, was colder than anything the sky had ever thrown at me. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I spent 31 years as a school principal in a small town in western Pennsylvania. I raised one child. I buried one husband. I built one life. Carefully, the way you build something you intend to last. And I believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has survived enough to know better, that family was the one thing that held. The one thing that didn't break. I was wrong about that too. The week before Christmas that year, I was already anxious in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself. My husband, Gerald, had been gone for 4 years. The house we'd shared for 32 years felt too big in December. Too many rooms that echoed, too many ornaments in a box I kept meaning to go through and kept not going through. I had tried to keep the traditions alive the way you try to keep a fire going when you're down to the last dry wood. A wreath on the door. A tin of cookies I baked on the 15th of every December, the same recipe my mother used. The little ceramic nativity set on the mantel that Gerald had bought at a church sale in 1987 and which I kept out of pure habit. Brandon had been calling more than usual that fall. That should have been the first signal, but I was a mother, and mothers have a particular gift for believing what they most want to believe. He was my only child. 43 years old, twice divorced, living in a rented house outside of Pittsburgh. He sold commercial real estate, or said he did, and he always had a new scheme on the horizon, a new deal that was going to change everything. Gerald had never warmed to him toward the end. Gerald would sit across from Brandon at the dinner table with an expression I recognized as patience stretched so thin it was practically transparent, and he would nod along to whatever Brandon was saying. And afterward, when Brandon's car had left the driveway, Gerald would get very quiet. "He's never satisfied," Gerald said once. We were washing dishes together, the way we always did, and he handed me a wet glass to dry and didn't say anything else for a long moment. "I worry about him, Evelyn, but not the way you worry." I asked him what that meant. He shook his head. "I worry about what he's capable of, when he doesn't get what he wants." I told him he was being uncharitable. Gerald didn't argue. He just nodded and dried his hands on the dish towel, and that was the end of it. Gerald died 8 months later, a heart attack, fast and without warning. The way the doctor said was actually a mercy. And I was left with his warning sitting in the back of my mind like a stone at the bottom of still water. Visible if you looked directly at it, easy to ignore if you kept your eyes elsewhere. I kept my eyes elsewhere. When Brandon suggested the family cabin for the holidays, I felt something unknot in my chest that I hadn't realized was tied up. The cabin had been in Gerald's family for decades. A 2-story timber structure on a private road in the mountains, surrounded by birch trees, with a wood stove that took 20 minutes to get going, and a front porch where Gerald and I had drunk coffee every morning during every summer vacation for 30 years. I hadn't been back since his death. It had felt like the wrong time, and then time kept passing, and it kept feeling wrong. "I think it'd do you good," Brandon said, on the phone that 3rd week of November. "Get out of the house, fresh air. It would be a real Christmas, Mom, the way Dad used to do it." Something about invoking his father should have made me suspicious. Brandon had spent most of Gerald's life rolling his eyes at the man. But grief does a funny thing to your critical faculties. You want so badly to believe the story where your child has matured, where they miss what you miss, where you can grieve together instead of separately. Who else would be coming? I asked. Oh, maybe Cousin Diane and her husband. A few people. I've been reaching out to the family. I thought it'd be good to get everyone together. That sounded reasonable. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I told him yes. I should have asked more questions. I should have called Diane myself. I should have done a dozen things differently, but I didn't, because I was a 68-year-old woman alone in a house that echoed, and my son was offering me Christmas. Trust. He arrived to pick me up on December 21st. The storm had been in the forecast for days. Not unusual for that part of Pennsylvania in December, but it had intensified overnight, and by the time Brandon pulled into the driveway at 2 in the afternoon, the sky was already the color of dirty wool, and the temperature had dropped 9 degrees since morning. I had packed a bag. A real bag. 5 days' worth of clothes, my medications, a box of those Christmas cookies, a wrapped gift for Diane's youngest. I came out the front door in my good winter coat and my hat and my boots, and I saw Brandon leaning against the car, not helping with my bag, looking at his phone. "You're going to want to hurry up," he said. "Storm's moving in." He didn't take my bag. He didn't open my car door. I told myself he was distracted, stressed about the weather. I told myself a lot of things in that driveway. The drive started normally enough. We took the highway north, then turned onto the 2-lane road that wound up into the mountains. For the first 40 minutes, Brandon was quiet in that particular way of his. Not comfortable silence, but the silence of someone who is managing something internally, keeping a lid on it. He answered my attempts at conversation in monosyllables. He kept checking his phone at red lights. "Is everything all right?" I finally asked. "Fine." He glanced at me. "You look tired." "I'm not tired. I'm trying to talk to you." I said, "I'm fine, Mom." Somewhere around the hour mark, the snow started in earnest. Not the gentle greeting card snow of the early season, but the hard, sideways kind that found every gap between the windshield and the defroster and turned the road ahead into a white blur. I gripped the door handle, an old habit of mine in bad weather, and watched the trees close in on either side of the road as we climbed higher. "Should we pull over?" I asked. "Wait it out somewhere?" "No need. Brandon, I can barely see the road." "I know this road." But he was slowing down. I noticed it before I fully registered it, the car decelerating in a way that didn't match the weather, too controlled, too deliberate. We were not slowing because of the storm. We were slowing because he had decided to slow. He turned onto a side road I didn't recognize. Single lane, barely maintained, the kind of road that loggers used in the summer and no one used in the winter. The trees crowded in close on both sides, their branches laced with ice that caught the headlights and threw it back in cold fragments. "This isn't the way to the cabin," I said. "Shortcut." "Brandon, I've been to that cabin 100 times. There's no shortcut through here." He didn't answer. He kept driving, and something that had been sitting at the edges of my awareness for the past hour, that low animal unease I had been explaining away as road anxiety, as concern about the weather, as holiday nerves, rose up and became something I couldn't name and couldn't dismiss. We drove another quarter-mile. Then he stopped the car. He didn't turn into a pull-off. He didn't park in any official sense. He simply stopped, in the middle of that logging road, with the trees pressing in on all sides and the snow coming down hard enough to muffle every sound except the engine and the faint hiss of it striking the windshield. He put the car in park, and then he sat there. "Brandon," my voice was steady, "I am proud of that, still. Why have we stopped?" He turned to look at me, and that was when I saw it. I had known my son's face for 43 years. I had watched it be a baby's face and a boy's face and a man's face. I had seen it crumple with tears and tighten with anger and smooth into the particular blankness he used when he didn't want to be read. But I had never seen it look the way it looked in that moment. Not cold, exactly, but evacuated, like something that had been there was now absent. "I need you to get out of the car," he said. I thought I had misheard him. The storm, the engine noise, I thought the words had jumbled in transit somewhere between his mouth and my ears. I'm sorry? Get out of the car, Mom. The word mom. He still said mom. That detail hit me in a way I still can't entirely explain, not with anger, not even the word itself. The fact that he could say it, that syllable that meant everything it had ever meant, while telling me to step out into a blizzard on an unmarked road in the mountains. Brandon? I kept my voice level because if I stopped keeping it level, I thought something would fracture that couldn't be put back together. It's 20 degrees outside. I don't have my phone with me. You know I left it charging at home. I know. 2 words. He knew. He had known when he offered to carry my bag into the car and I'd said, no, I've got it, and he hadn't argued. He knew when I'd gone back inside for a last look around and he'd stood by the car, not coming in. He had taken stock of what I had and what I didn't. The cabin, I said. Diane is expecting. There's no cabin trip, Mom. He was staring at the steering wheel now, not at me, at the wheel, like he was reading something printed on it. Diane doesn't know anything about this. Nobody does. I sat very still. Outside, the snow fell without pause or mercy. A branch cracked somewhere in the trees, the weight of ice. What is this? I whispered. You have early-stage dementia. He said it with the flat delivery of someone reciting facts. That's what the doctor says. You've been getting worse. You can't manage the house, the finances. You're not safe on your own. I've been trying to figure out what to do for months. Every word was a lie. I knew it immediately, with the clarity you sometimes only get in extremis, when the body understands the threat before the mind can process it, when survival sharpens everything. I did not have dementia. No doctor had told him any such thing. I had a regular physician, a woman I'd seen for 15 years, and she had told me at my October appointment that I was in fine health for my age. Blood pressure a touch elevated, knees that complained about stairs, nothing else. No doctor has told you that, I said. Dr. Haskell, he's been concerned about you. I have never in my life seen anyone named Dr. Haskell. He finally looked at me. Mom, you don't always remember your appointments. And there it was. The particular cruelty of it, not just the lie, but the kind of lie it was. A lie that turned my own mind against me. A lie that made the very act of denying it seem like proof. I felt something then that I'm going to try to describe accurately because it matters. It was not panic. It was not even quite fear, though fear was there underneath it. It was a specific kind of grief, fast and total, like a structure collapsing, for the version of my son I had spent 43 years believing in. The boy I'd sat up with through fevers. The teenager I'd defended to Gerald more times than I could count. The man I'd lent money to, made excuses for, kept faith in, past every reasonable point of return. That version of him didn't exist. Maybe it never had. Maybe I had built him out of what I needed him to be, the way you furnished an empty room with what you had, wanting it to look like a home. Get out of the car, he said again. No. The word surprised him. I could see it. A small flinch, quickly controlled. He hadn't expected that. He had expected, I think, the version of me he'd convinced himself existed. Disoriented, compliant, easily managed. He'd expected a woman who would be confused and frightened, and in her confusion and fright would do what she was told. That was not the woman sitting in his passenger seat. Mom, don't. I turned to face him fully. My hands were trembling, but my voice was not. I know exactly what you're doing, and I know exactly why. And I want you to understand something. However this night ends, whatever you think is going to happen, you have not thought it through. You have never thought anything through. Something moved across his face. A flicker of something that might have been shame or might have been calculation. With Brandon, those two things had always been hard to tell apart. This is for your own good, he said. Don't insult me. You can't manage. Brandon, my voice finally broke. Not from grief, from a specific focused fury that I had been containing for a very long time. I managed a school of 400 students for 3 decades. I managed your father's illness and his death. I managed this family through more than you will ever know. I have managed myself across 68 years with considerably more grace and competence than you have ever managed anything. Don't you dare tell me what I can and cannot manage." A long silence. The snow. The branch somewhere above us, groaning under its load. Then he reached across me. I thought for a moment he was reaching for me, and my breath stopped. And he opened the passenger door from the inside. The cold came in like a wall. "Get out of the car," he said for the third time. His voice had gone completely flat. Whatever had been behind his eyes before was gone. He was somewhere past that now, in a place I didn't recognize and didn't want to. I sat there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough to run the calculation that I understood, on some level, had only one answer. He was bigger than me, and the car was already stopped, and if I stayed, the options were few and none of them good. I got out of the car. The cold was immediate and total. My coat, my good winter coat, the one I'd worn on the drive up, a decent wool blend that was fine for a parking lot or a short walk between buildings, was not made for this. Not for standing still on a logging road in a blizzard, with the temperature still dropping and the wind moving hard through the tree line. I turned back to the car. Brandon had already closed the passenger door. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield. The headlights lit the snow in front of him in a narrow, indifferent cone. I knocked on the window. "Brandon?" He didn't look at me. "Brandon, I need my bag. I need my medications." Nothing. The engine ran. The wipers moved. He stared at the middle distance. I knocked harder. "My heart medication is in that bag. Brandon, do you hear me?" He put the car in reverse. I stepped back. Instinct, pure and simple, and watched him back down the logging road the way we'd come. Cautiously, his reverse lights red against the white. He turned with more skill than I would have expected in those conditions. And then the headlights swept around and he was pointed the other direction and the car was moving, and within 30 seconds the taillights had been swallowed by the snow and I was alone. The sound of the engine faded. The wind filled in around the absence of it. I stood in the dark on a logging road I didn't know, in a storm that was getting worse. With no phone, no medications, the clothes on my back, and the absolute knowledge that my son had just left me here to die. Not to struggle, not to be found quickly. To die. Because here is what I understood, standing in that dark. Brandon had not made an impulsive decision. You do not drive your mother 2 hours into the mountains on a specific road, in a specific storm, on a specific day, because something came over you. You do not feed yourself a ready-made story about dementia and incompetence because it occurred to you that morning. You think about it, you plan it, you decide. He had decided, and he thought he had accounted for everything. I started walking, not because I had a plan, not because I knew where I was going. I started walking because the alternative was standing still, and standing still in those conditions was something I understood, with the calm and terrible clarity of that hour, was not survivable. The human body loses heat faster than it generates it at those temperatures. Standing still was choosing. I was not ready to choose that. The road I was on ran, I thought, roughly parallel to the main road we'd turned off. If I could reach the main road, there was at least the theoretical possibility of a passing car, a plow truck, something. The logging road itself had come off to the left, which meant the main road was to the right if I went back the way we'd come in. I turned right and started walking. The snow was already past my ankles. My boots, decent boots, winter boots, were not made for snowfall this depth, this sustained. Within 10 minutes, my feet were wet. Within 20, I had stopped being able to feel my toes. I had my coat. I had my hat. I had my gloves, thin dress gloves, the kind you wear to look presentable, not the kind you wear to survive. I put my hands in my coat pockets and kept walking and tried very hard not to calculate the odds. I thought about Gerald. Not continuously. My mind was too occupied with the mechanics of walking, of staying upright on the ice beneath the snow. But he was there in the background of everything, the way he had been every day since his death. I thought about what he had said that evening in the kitchen. I worry about what he's capable of when he doesn't get what he wants. Gerald, you were right, and I am sorry, and I should have listened. I don't know how long I walked. Time does a strange thing in those conditions. It stretches and compresses simultaneously so that a minute feels like 10 and an hour can vanish without accounting for itself. I know that I fell twice. The first time I caught myself on a tree branch and stood up and kept going. The second time I went down hard on my knee, and the pain of it was clarifying in a horrible, useful way. It made everything very sharp and very immediate, and it kept me from going somewhere warm and internal, which I understood was a direction I should not go. I was thinking about sitting down, just for a moment, just to rest the knee, when I saw the light. Not the diffuse glow of distant civilization, but a specific moving light. Headlights. Coming down the main road. I don't remember making the decision to run. I remember being stationary, and then I was moving faster than I had moved in years, breaking through the brush at the edge of the logging road, stumbling out onto the shoulder of the main road, waving both arms above my head with everything I had. The headlight swept across me. The vehicle braked, stopped. A truck. A Park Service truck. Its roof a pale shape under the accumulated snow. The door opened. A person got out. A figure in the kind of gear you wear when the weather is actually trying to kill you, which it was, and came toward me at a run. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you all right?" I opened my mouth to say yes, or "I'm fine," or some other reflexive reassurance. What came out instead was a sound I didn't recognize as mine, broken and completely honest. The ranger, his name was Cole, I would learn later, 29 years old, working a solo night shift along this section of mountain road because of the storm conditions, caught me before my legs gave out entirely. He was talking as he lowered me to a crouch, checking my hands, my face, asking the questions they're trained to ask. I heard him, but distantly, from inside the sound of my own breathing. He got me into the truck. He turned the heat to its highest setting. He called it in on his radio. Found a woman on foot, mountain road, significant exposure, I need a status on the nearest clinic. And he kept talking to me the whole time, not to get information, I realized, but to keep me present, to keep me here. "Someone left you out there?" he asked at one point. I looked at the heater vent and felt the warmth begin to work its way back into my face, and I thought about how to answer that. Whether to say yes, whether to say my son, and what it would mean to say those words out loud. To make them real in the way that saying them to another person makes things real. "Yes," I said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Do you want to tell me who?" I looked at him then. 29 years old, serious face, the kind of face that doesn't perform sympathy, but has the real thing somewhere behind it. "Not yet," I said. Can we drive for a little while first?" He nodded. He put the truck in gear. We moved down the mountain through the storm, the wipers working steadily, the heater filling the cab with warmth I had stopped being sure I would ever feel again. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched the snow, and felt the heat returning to my fingers, degree by degree, and thought about my son driving back down the mountain road in the other direction, toward whatever story he had prepared for after. He didn't know me as well as he thought he did. He never had. The clinic was 40 minutes down the mountain, a small emergency facility attached to a volunteer fire station in a town whose name I didn't catch when we pulled in. A nurse named Pamela took over from Ranger Cole with brisk efficiency, got me out of my wet coat, checked my core temperature, wrapped me in those foil blankets that look like something from a space program and feel, against all expectation, like the warmest thing you've ever touched. My toes, when the sensation came back, hurt in a way that made me grip the exam table and breathe through my teeth. Pamela said the pain was a good sign. "Things that are going properly numb," she explained, "stop hurting first." "Your blood pressure is elevated," she said. "It's always elevated." "More than usual." "I was just left on a mountain in a blizzard." She looked at me over the chart with an expression that suggested she had heard that sentence before, or sentences like it, which was somehow both surprising and not at all. Cole waited. He didn't have to. He could have logged the call and gone back to his patrol. But he waited in the hall outside while Pamela worked, and when she finally said I was stable and could be transferred to a proper hospital in the morning but was safe for the night, he came back in and sat in the visitor's chair and took out a small notebook. "I need to know what happened," he said. "If you're ready." I looked at him. Outside, the storm was still going. I could hear it against the clinic's single window. That low, insistent sound of sustained weather, relentless. I thought about the car stopping on that road, the door opening, the cold. "My son," I said. "His name is Brandon Hale." Cole wrote it down. "I need you to understand something," I said. "Before I tell you the rest of it, I'm not confused. I don't have dementia. I'm not someone who gets lost or forgets things or makes up stories. I was a school principal for 31 years. I paused. "I know exactly what happened to me tonight, and I know exactly why." Cole looked up from his notebook. "Tell me," he said. So I did. Not everything. I didn't yet know everything. Not then, not in that clinic room on that night. I told him what I knew: the drive, the road, the door opening, the cold. Brandon's face when he told me to get out. The 3 times he said it. Cole wrote steadily. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is there someone you can call?" he asked. "Family, a friend." I thought about that. Diane, Gerald's cousin, the one Brandon had named as if she were part of this. I hadn't spoken to Diane in 3 months, not since a brief phone call in September. Had Brandon been speaking to her? Had he been laying groundwork there too? "There's someone," I said. "I'm not sure yet how much she knows." "That's all right." Cole closed his notebook. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight." He was right. There was time for the figuring, time for all of it. The full accounting of what Brandon had done, the extent of it, the parts of it I didn't yet know about and wouldn't know about for days and weeks and months. That was coming. It was all coming. But in that clinic room, wrapped in foil, my fingers slowly returning to feeling, my heart rate coming down from whatever altitude it had reached on that logging road. In that room, with the storm outside and Pamela moving quietly around, and a young ranger who had stopped to ask if I was all right, and stayed because I was... In that room, I let myself be here. Just here. Not somewhere else. Not on the road. Not in my kitchen 4 years ago hearing Gerald's warning for the last time. Here. Alive. The cold was still in me. It would take days to fully leave, to stop waking me in the night with shivers I couldn't explain. But it was mine now. Mine to carry. Mine to work through. And I thought, with the particular stubbornness that had kept me walking up that logging road when sitting down would have been easier, when stopping would have been so much simpler. Whatever my son thought he had settled tonight, he was wrong. The hospital in the valley kept me for 2 days. Not because anything was critically wrong, my core temperature had stabilized at the clinic, and Pamela had caught the early frostbite on my toes before it progressed past the first stage. But because my blood pressure wouldn't come down, and the attending physician, a tired-looking man named Dr. Okafor, who I suspected had been on shift since the previous morning, said he wanted to monitor it before releasing me to go anywhere. "Do you have someone who can come?" he asked, standing at the foot of my hospital bed with my chart in his hands. "I'm working on that," I said. I had been given a phone. A nurse named Terry had handed me a clinic cell when I asked, without any fuss, which I appreciated more than I could say. I had been staring at the contact list I was constructing in my head for 2 hours, running through names, running through what I knew and what I didn't know, and what I couldn't yet afford to assume. Brandon had mentioned Diane. He'd said her name casually, the way you say a name when you want it to sound like nothing. Like it was just a detail, just a reference point. I know now that nothing Brandon said was ever just a detail. He used words the way a contractor uses materials. Everything placed with a purpose. Everything load-bearing. I called Diane at 7:30 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was already awake, which told me something else, which I filed away without quite knowing yet what to do with it. "Evelyn?" Her voice was cautious in a way that hit me somewhere below the sternum. Not surprised, cautious. "I'm in a hospital," I said. "In the valley. I need you to come." A pause. "What happened?" "I'll explain when you get here. Can you come, Diane?" Another pause, and in that pause I heard something I had been dreading, a hesitation that wasn't logistical. It wasn't the pause of a person rearranging their schedule. It was the pause of a person deciding something. "Of course," she said finally. "I'll be there by noon." She was there by 11:15. She came in with her coat still on and her scarf half unwound, and she looked at me in that hospital bed, and her face did something complicated, relief and guilt, and something she was working hard to keep behind her eyes. I let her sit down. I let her pour herself a cup of the terrible coffee from the machine in the hall, and then I told her everything, the drive, the road, the door. Diane listened without interrupting, which was unlike her. She was a talker, had always been a talker, the kind of person who filled silences reflexively. That she was silent told me she was processing something she hadn't expected, or something she was hearing differently now that she was hearing it from me. When I finished, she set her coffee cup down on the bedside table and looked at her hands. "He called me," she said. "Brandon, about 6 weeks ago." "I know." She looked up. "He said you'd been having episodes, that you'd left the stove on twice, gotten lost driving to the pharmacy. He said he was worried about you being alone." I waited. "He asked if I'd noticed anything, when we talked, whether you seemed off." "And what did you tell him?" Her jaw tightened. "I told him you seemed fine to me, the same as always. And he said—" She stopped. "Tell me." "He said that was part of it, that you'd gotten very good at hiding it, that people with early cognitive decline often seemed completely normal in short conversations." I sat with that for a moment. The elegance of it, in a horrible way. The way he had constructed it so that every piece of evidence against his story became, in his telling, more evidence for it. My apparent competence, proof of how advanced my concealment had become. Diane's own good judgment, neutralized in advance. "He's been building this for a while," I said. "Evelyn, I'm sorry. I didn't think. I'm not angry with you." And I meant it, though there was something underneath the meaning that was harder to name. A grief, maybe, at how easily it had worked. How ready people were, even people who loved me, to believe the story that required least of them. I need to know what else he said. What else he said, it turned out, was considerable. Diane pulled out her phone and showed me a text thread. Brandon had been messaging her periodically since October. Brief, concerned updates, the kind that read as a devoted son keeping family informed. Mom seemed confused when I visited last week. Took her to a specialist, but she won't remember going. I'm trying to figure out the best care situation. I don't want to worry everyone, but I also don't think she should be alone much longer. I read through them twice. Each message was calibrated. Just specific enough to sound credible, just vague enough that nothing could be directly checked. He'd told Diane not to say anything to me directly because it would upset me and I'd deny it, which was, of course, exactly what he knew I would do. "Has he talked to anyone else?" I asked. "Your neighbor, Ruth, and—" Diane hesitated. "Gerald's brother, Tom. Tom Mercer. Gerald's younger brother who controlled one of the secondary trusts in the Mercer estate and whose signature would be required for certain decisions about the family property, including the cabin, including the sale of the cabin, which I had been told twice in the past year was not something anyone was considering." "When did he talk to Tom?" "I don't know. Tom mentioned it to me at Thanksgiving, said Brandon had reached out." I looked at the ceiling. I am not a person who cries easily. Gerald used to say I cried at exactly the right things, which meant I almost never cried. But in that moment, I felt something behind my eyes that I had to work against. Not grief. Something more like vertigo. The feeling of looking down and discovering the floor is much further away than you thought. My son had not made one impulsive, terrible decision on a mountain road in December. My son had spent months preparing for it. I was released the following afternoon. Diane took me not to my own house. Neither of us thought that was wise yet, for reasons we didn't have to say out loud, but to hers, a 40-minute drive south, a house I'd been to a dozen times over the years for holidays and impromptu dinners, and one memorable afternoon when we'd sat on her back porch and she'd helped me write the hardest letter I'd ever written, the one to Brandon after he missed Gerald's funeral service because of a deal that fell through at the last minute. He hadn't missed it, in the end. He'd arrived an hour late, just as the gathering was breaking up, and shaken hands and said the right things and left again within 40 minutes. I had told myself it was grief, I had told myself a lot of things about Brandon across a lot of years. Diane gave me the guest room and didn't hover, which was exactly right. She brought me soup and left me alone to eat it, and she picked up the phone when I needed to use it and gave it to me without asking who I was calling. And by the time the sun went down on that second day outside the hospital, I had spoken to 3 people. The first was Cole, the ranger. He had filed a report the night of the storm, and he told me there was an ongoing inquiry, but that it would help significantly to have me speak with a detective. I told him I understood. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. The second call was harder. It was to my attorney, a man named Warren Finch, who had drawn up Gerald's estate documents and updated them twice since his death, and who I had not spoken to since the previous spring. Warren was 71 years old and had practiced estate law for nearly 4 decades, and when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a very long moment. "Evelyn," he said, "I need you to listen to me carefully." "I'm listening." "When did you last review the estate documents?" "We updated them 14 months ago, after I refinanced the house." "And has anyone, Brandon, anyone, contacted you about making further changes since then?" I went still. "No. Why?" "Because I received a call," Warren said. 3 months ago. A man identifying himself as your physician called to say you were experiencing cognitive decline and had asked him to facilitate a guardianship arrangement. He provided documentation. The blood left my face. I could feel it happening, the specific physical sensation of shock moving through a body, that cold cascade. "What physician?" I said, though I already knew. "A Dr. Gerald Haskell. He provided credentials, a practice address. He said you had signed paperwork authorizing him to speak on your behalf about estate matters." "Warren," I kept my voice even, "I have never seen a physician by that name in my life." A pause. "That's what I suspected," Warren said. "When I called the number he'd left and got a disconnected line. I flagged the inquiry and didn't proceed, but I didn't contact you because, frankly, Evelyn, I didn't know what I was dealing with and I didn't want to alarm you prematurely. You should have called me." "Yes," he said. "I should have. I'm sorry." I pressed the phone against my ear and stared at the guest room wall and did the arithmetic that was assembling itself in my mind piece by piece with a dreadful and clarifying momentum. A fake physician, fabricated documentation, an attempt to initiate guardianship proceedings that would have given Brandon legal authority over my affairs, my finances, my estate. All of it built months ago, carefully, methodically, the way you build something you intend to be permanent. And underneath all of it, a question I had been circling since the moment the car door opened in the snow. Why now? What had shifted? What had Brandon seen or learned or been threatened by that made him decide that the time for patience was over? The third call answered that. I called my bank. I spoke to a fraud specialist after navigating 3 levels of automated phone system, which under ordinary circumstances would have driven me to distraction, but which I moved through with a focused, cold patience I didn't know I had. The specialist's name was Renata, and she was professional and careful, and when she pulled up my accounts, she went very quiet for a moment before she said, in the measured tone of someone delivering news they've had to deliver before, "Ms. Mercer, there have been a series of transfers from your primary savings account over the past 7 months. Would you like me to walk you through them?" 7 months. While he was calling Diane with his careful little updates, while he was reaching out to Tom Mercer about the cabin, while he was fabricating a physician and trying to initiate guardianship. For 7 months, transfers had been leaving my savings account, not in one large sum that would have triggered an automatic alert. Smaller amounts moved at irregular intervals, $1,500 here, $2,000 there. Once $4,500 in a single transaction that had occurred, Renata noted, the same week I had been in the hospital with a knee replacement and therefore demonstrably occupied. The total, across 7 months, came to just over $63,000. I had known Gerald's estate was substantial. I had not known exactly how much was in the savings account, in the way that people who have lived carefully and not worried excessively about money often don't know the precise figure. I had thought it was around $200,000. It was, before the transfers began, $218,000. It was now, Renata told me, $154,000 and change. How? I asked. Not emotionally, mechanically. I needed the mechanism. It appears someone had your account credentials. The transfers were initiated online. There was no alert triggered because the account had a linked access profile that was set up. A pause, a sound of keys clicking. 11 months ago, under your name and your security answers. 11 months ago. I had been to a family gathering at Brandon's house 11 months ago, a birthday dinner for his daughter from his first marriage, a little girl named Lily who was turning 9 and who I adored and who Brandon used as leverage the same way he used everything, as a currency, as a door to leave open, as a reason for me to keep coming back. I had used Brandon's laptop at that dinner to look something up because my phone battery had died. I had logged into my bank account. I had thought I'd logged out. I told Renata I needed to report it as fraud. She walked me through the process with the careful efficiency of someone who has done this many times and knows that efficiency is its own form of kindness. When we were done, she said the investigation could take several weeks and that my account had been temporarily frozen pending review, which meant I was, at the moment, without access to my own money. I thanked her and ended the call and sat on the edge of the guest bed for a long moment. $63,000. Not a number Brandon had arrived at by accident. Enough to significantly damage what I had. Not enough, not yet, to ruin it entirely. Which told me something about the timeline he'd had in mind. He wasn't done. The mountain road wasn't an act of desperation. It was, I began to understand, step 2 of something that was meant to have more steps. First, the guardianship paperwork, which would have given him legal access to everything. When that didn't move forward, when Warren refused to proceed without verification, he had accelerated. The mountain road was the acceleration. He had tried to do it legally first. When the legal route stalled, he had decided to remove me from the equation entirely. I sat with that until I could hold it without it undoing me. It took a while. Then I got up, went to the window, and looked at Diane's backyard in the December dark. The bare trees, the patio furniture under its winter covers, a bird feeder she'd forgotten to fill. Small, ordinary things. The kind of things that are always there when the extraordinary is happening, indifferent and real. I had built something. Gerald and I, together, over decades. The house, the savings, the estate that bore his family's name. We had not built it to be taken. We had not built it to be dismantled by the one person I had trusted with the knowledge of its existence. I had made mistakes. I had missed warnings. I had let things go on longer than they should have, out of love that was real even when its object was unworthy of it. That was true, and I didn't turn away from it. My love for Brandon was real. It had always been real. And he had used that reality the way a thief uses an unlocked door, not as something to be grateful for, but as an access point. I would not be an unlocked door anymore. I went to find Diane. She was in the kitchen, doing what Diane always did when she didn't know what else to do, which was clean something that was already clean. I sat down at the table and told her I needed her help. Specifically, I needed her to help me reach Tom Mercer before Brandon did again, and I needed Warren Finch to prepare documents, and I needed several other things besides that I had not quite worked out yet, but would. Diane listened. Then she put down her dish towel. "Tell me what you need," she said. It was a simple sentence, 4 words. But after the previous 72 hours, those 4 words felt like something solid under my feet in a place where the ground had given way. I told her, and we started making calls. What I did not know then, what I would not know for another week until Warren had done his work and the bank's fraud team had done theirs, and a detective named Patricia Souza had sat across from me at a table in a county sheriff's office and walked me through what they were finding, was the full shape of it. Brandon had not been working alone, exactly. He had not had a partner in the criminal sense, but he had been using a network of small deceptions the way someone uses scaffolding, each piece supporting the next, none of it impressive individually, all of it together allowing him to reach heights he couldn't have reached alone. The fabricated physician, Dr. Haskell, turned out to be a real person, a retired doctor whose identity Brandon had partially appropriated, enough to construct a convincing credential package. Detective Souza showed me a copy of the letter that had been sent to Warren Finch. I read it 3 times. It was written in the careful, jargon-heavy language of medical documentation, full of terms that would sound credible to a layperson and were plausible enough to require actual checking rather than immediate dismissal. Brandon had done his research. He had always been better at research than he was at anything that required sustained effort, which was, I thought, a very particular kind of intelligence put entirely in service of the wrong things. There were also conversations, Sousa told me, that had apparently taken place with two other family members I hadn't known about. A second cousin on Gerald's side, who controlled a small parcel of land adjacent to the cabin property, and an elderly aunt in Ohio who had been told, in a phone call, that I was no longer able to manage my own affairs and had asked Brandon to coordinate on my behalf. The aunt, Marion, was 84 and nearly deaf and had, Sousa said gently, apparently accepted what she was told without question. Marion. I had sent her a birthday card every year for 20 years. She had sent me Christmas cookies, the same shortbread recipe every December. She was 84 years old and barely left her house, and Brandon had called her and told her I was declining. And she had said okay, she was sorry to hear it, she hoped I'd be comfortable. I cried then. Not for myself. For Marion, and what it meant that someone had called that sweet, deaf, isolated old woman and used her as a tool. Are you all right? Sousa asked. No, I said. Keep going. Because the truth, all of it, every piece, was the only thing I had now that was fully mine. No one could take it from me as long as I kept facing it directly. So I faced it. I sat in that county office and listened and took notes in the small notebook Diane had given me, and I let it be as bad as it was, and I did not look away. The full accounting was still incomplete. There were pieces Warren was still working on, threads Sousa's office was still pulling, but the shape of it was clear enough by then. Brandon had spent the better part of a year constructing the conditions for my disappearance, not from the world necessarily, though that mountain road argued for the worst interpretation, but from my own life. He had wanted me declared incompetent, isolated from family, stripped of financial control, and eventually removed from any meaningful decision-making about the estate. Whether he had intended the mountain to be a permanent solution or simply a drastic measure to buy himself time while the guardianship paperwork was resubmitted under less scrutiny, I couldn't say for certain, and I found that I was not quite ready to look that particular question directly in the eye. What I knew was this. I was still here. I was cold and tired, and my knee ached where I'd fallen, and I was temporarily without access to my bank account, and the person I had loved most completely and most foolishly in the last decade had tried, in one way or another, to erase me. And I had one thing he hadn't counted on. I had Warren Finch, I had Detective Sousa, I had Diane, washing a clean counter in her kitchen. I had Ranger Cole, who had filed his report and was answering every follow-up call within the hour. And I had the thing Brandon had tried hardest to take from me, the absolute unfractured clarity of a woman who knows exactly what was done to her and exactly who did it. He thought he had planned for everything. He had not planned for me to survive the night. And I had. Warren Finch called me on the morning of January 9th with the particular tone of a man who has spent the intervening weeks doing serious work and is ready to show it. I need you to come in, he said. There are things I can walk you through on the phone, but this is better done in person. How bad is it? A pause that told me more than he intended. Come in, Evelyn. I was still at Diane's. I'd gone back to my own house once in the 2 weeks since the hospital. Just once, with Diane driving and waiting in the car while I went through the rooms. I don't know exactly what I expected to feel, walking back through my own front door. Something dramatic, maybe. Something proportional to what had happened. Instead, I felt a flat, practical clarity. The house was cold because I'd turned the heat down before leaving. The Christmas wreath was still on the door. The tin of cookies was still on the kitchen counter, where I'd left it before getting into Brandon's car. I went through my desk. 3 drawers, organized the way I had always organized them, by category, by date, the way a person who has managed large institutions for decades organizes things. I took what I needed, the original estate documents, the folder of account statements I kept paper copies of, Gerald's will. I stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the cookies. Then I left them there and went back to the car. That had been 10 days ago. I was ready, now, to sit across from Warren and hear what the full accounting looked like. Diane drove me. She had been doing that, quietly, without making it a thing, simply being available in the particular way of people who understand that presence matters more than words. I had not thanked her enough. I knew that. Some things accumulate in the category of debts you can't repay directly and have to honor in other ways. Warren's office was in a converted Victorian on the main street of a town about 20 miles from my house. He had been there for 30 years, in the same set of rooms, with the same dark wood paneling and the same slightly too warm radiator and the same framed photograph on the wall of a fishing trip he'd taken with Gerald sometime in the mid-90s. I had sat in his client chair a dozen times across as many years. I sat in it now and folded my hands in my lap and waited. Warren was not a man who softened things unnecessarily. It was one of the reasons Gerald had trusted him, and one of the reasons I trusted him too. "The fraud case is building well," he said, opening the first of several folders on his desk. "Sousa's office has the bank records, the correspondence with the fabricated physician, and 3 witness statements from family members Brandon contacted. That's the criminal side. That moves at its own pace and we don't control it. I understand. What we do control is the estate." He looked at me over his glasses. "And that's what I want to talk about." What Warren had found in the 2 weeks since I'd called him from Diane's kitchen was this. Brandon had not limited himself to the savings account. The $63,000 Renata at the bank had identified was only the most visible portion of what he'd been doing. There was also a line of credit attached to the house, a home equity line that I had opened 7 years ago for a renovation project and then largely forgotten about, that showed a draw of $22,000 18 months prior. I had not made that draw. The signature on the documentation was close enough to mine to have passed an initial review, but a forensic document examiner Warren had engaged said it was not a match. $22,000. Drawn against the equity in my house, the house Gerald and I had paid off together in 2009, the house that was supposed to be mine outright and entirely. "There may be more," Warren said. "We're still looking." I was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the January street was gray and empty, the way small-town streets are in January, stripped of the pretense of holiday decoration, back to their actual bones. "He must have needed money badly," I said, "to move this fast, to take this many risks." Warren nodded. "Detective Sousa ran a financial background. Brandon has significant debts, 2 judgments against him from failed business dealings, a tax lien, and what appears to be a private loan from someone who is," she used the word motivated, "about collecting." I thought about that. About the particular desperation of a person who has borrowed from the wrong people and run out of legitimate options. About how that desperation can make choices that seemed unthinkable look, through a certain lens, like the only available logic. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that. I tried, sitting in Warren's office on that gray January morning, to locate something charitable in myself toward my son, and I couldn't find it. Maybe it was there somewhere, buried under everything else, and would resurface later. But in that moment, all I could think about was Marion, 84 years old and nearly deaf, being told her cousin's widow was declining. All I could think about was the door opening and the cold and the sound of his tires on the snow as he drove away. "Tell me about the estate documents," I said. Warren set down the folder he was holding and picked up another, thicker one. "This is where I need you to follow me carefully." I said I was following. The Mercer estate, as Gerald had structured it, was divided across several instruments. The house itself, held in my name outright, a primary trust containing the bulk of the liquid assets, which I controlled as sole trustee with Brandon named as remainder beneficiary. Several smaller secondary instruments tied to specific properties, including the cabin, and a family partnership structure that Gerald had set up in the late 90s, primarily for tax purposes. Brandon, as remainder beneficiary of the primary trust, stood to inherit its full value upon my death. That was the architecture Gerald had built. Gerald had built it when Brandon was a different, or at least a less fully revealed, version of himself, and when neither of us had imagined that we would ever need the structure to protect me from the person it was designed to benefit. "The trust can be amended," Warren said. You are the sole trustee. You have full amendment authority. I know. What you may not know, he paused, or may not have been focused on, given everything, another pause, is that I took a step when you called me from Diane's kitchen, before we discussed strategy, before I knew the full picture. I looked at him. What step? Warren opened the thick folder. Inside was a document I hadn't seen before, very new pages dated 3 weeks prior, bearing the name of the Mercer Family Trust at the top, and at the bottom, my signature. I stared at it. I didn't sign this. No, Warren said. You didn't. Not yet. He let that sit for a moment. What I did, Evelyn, when you called me, when you told me what had happened on that mountain road, was begin preparing an amendment. I didn't file it. I didn't execute it. I can't do either of those things without your signature and your explicit direction. But I drafted it because I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I know that in situations like this one, time is a resource, and you don't waste it. He slid the document across the desk to me. I read it. I am not a lawyer, but I've read enough legal documents across enough years to understand what I'm looking at. What I was looking at was a comprehensive amendment that restructured the primary trust from a simple remainder arrangement into a fully protected discretionary trust, removed Brandon Hale as remainder beneficiary entirely, established a professional corporate trustee as co-trustee to remove any possibility of undue influence claims, and redirected the remainder interest to a set of charitable purposes and specific named individuals. Diane, Tom Mercer's children, Lily, Brandon's daughter, who was 9 years old and had done nothing except be born to the wrong father. If I sign this, I said, Brandon receives nothing from the primary trust upon your death. His name is removed from the instrument entirely. He has no standing to contest it as long as you sign it while demonstrating full capacity, which, Warren looked at me steadily. I am entirely prepared to document and witness. I sat with the document in my hands. Outside, a car went by. The radiator ticked. The photograph of Gerald on the fishing trip caught the winter light from the window at an angle that made it look almost warm. I thought about whether I was doing this from anger. You have to ask yourself that question at moments like this one. Whether you are making a permanent decision in a temporary state of fury, whether you are choosing something you will regret when the fury passes. But this was not fury. I recognized fury. I had felt it on that mountain road. Felt it in the hospital, felt it reading Brandon's text messages on Diane's phone. This was something else. This was the sober, clear-eyed acknowledgement of a situation as it actually was, stripped of every illusion I had once used to make it more comfortable. Brandon had shown me exactly what he was capable of. He had shown me clearly and completely. The only thing I would be regretting if I didn't sign was the decision to keep pretending that love meant I had to keep leaving myself unprotected. You cannot love someone into being different than they are. I know that sounds simple. It sounds like the kind of thing that's stitched on a pillow, something you nod at and move on from. But living it, actually arriving at it, after decades of trying the alternative, is one of the hardest things a person can do. I signed the document. Warren witnessed it. His assistant came in and notarized it. The whole thing took 11 minutes. When it was done, Warren said he would file the amendment with the trust's registered agent that afternoon and have certified copies to me by the end of the week. There's one more thing, he said, as I was putting on my coat. I stopped. Brandon has requested a family meeting. He reached out to Tom Mercer last week. He's proposing a gathering of the principal family members to discuss Evelyn's situation. His words. He suggested the third Saturday of February. I looked at Warren for a long moment. All right, I said, let's have a meeting. The next 4 weeks were not easy. I want to be accurate about that because it would be dishonest to suggest that signing a document made the weight of things lift. I went back to my house in late January, properly this time, with a bag, intending to stay. I turned the heat up and I stood in the kitchen and I threw away the tin of cookies. Not in anger. They were just old, and keeping them felt like keeping something I had no use for anymore. I slept badly. My knee was healing slowly, and the cold had done something to my circulation that my doctor, my actual doctor, not the phantom Dr. Haskell, said would improve over time but needed patience. I didn't have much patience left for physical inconvenience, which meant some nights I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle and going through everything in my head. I thought about Lily. I thought about her a great deal. She lived with her mother, Brandon's first ex-wife, a quiet woman named Sandra who had managed to leave the marriage with her dignity mostly intact, which in retrospect told me things about Sandra I should have paid closer attention to. Lily had my eyes, or so Diane said. Gerald's eyes, really. That particular gray-green that was distinctive in the Mercer family. She was 9 years old, and she came to my house 3 or 4 times a year, and she liked the cookies and the stories I told her about the students I'd taught, and she had nothing to do with any of this and everything to lose from it. I had been careful about Lily in the trust amendment. Her share was structured separately, in an education trust that nothing else could touch, that no trustee could redirect, that existed for no other purpose than to ensure that Gerald's granddaughter could go to college without asking anyone's permission. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to everything I wanted to do for her. But it was protected, and protection was what I knew how to build. I also called Sandra. I had not spoken to her since the previous spring, and the call was awkward in the way of calls between people whose only shared context is a man neither of them should have trusted. But Sandra was. She was good. She listened. She didn't dramatize. And when I told her that Lily had been provided for regardless of what happened next, Sandra said something I wasn't expecting. She talks about you, you know. Lily does, after every visit. I didn't know what to say to that. She told me last spring that her dad's mom was the only grown-up she knew who talked to her like she was a real person. Sandra paused. I thought you should know that. I thanked her and got off the phone quickly because something had gone wrong with my composure and I needed a minute with that privately. Lily, 9 years old, her father had tried to leave her grandmother to die in the snow, and she talked about me after visits. I held that. I did not let it make me sentimental about Brandon. Sentimentality was a resource I had finally, fully depleted, but I let it remind me why the structure I was building mattered, not just for me, for the people who were actually paying attention, the people who actually showed up. What? The family meeting was set for the 3rd Saturday of February, as Brandon had proposed, because I had learned enough about my son to know that letting him choose the date was its own form of preparation. He would spend those weeks constructing his version of events. He would arrive at that meeting with a story fully assembled, with his particular kind of performed concern already deployed, expecting to find the usual landscape, confused relatives, a mother who could be managed, enough ambient uncertainty to work in. He would not find that. Warren arranged for the meeting to take place at his office rather than at a family home, which was my specific request and which Brandon accepted without apparent suspicion, which told me either he didn't notice the significance or he didn't think it mattered. I had spent enough years trying to determine which failure of Brandon's attention applied in any given situation, and I had decided to stop trying. It didn't matter. The outcome was the same. I arrived 20 minutes early. Diane was with me. Tom Mercer came in a few minutes later. He had driven up from Maryland 6 hours, which I hadn't expected and which moved me more than I showed. Tom was 73, the quieter of the Mercer brothers, a man who expressed loyalty through action rather than statement. He shook my hand and looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, "You look like Gerald when you're angry." He had that same, he gestured at his own face, that same thing around the eyes. Is that a compliment? Gerald scared the hell out of people when he was angry, Tom said. So yes. Warren's assistant set up the conference room with water and a tray of coffee that no one touched. Detective Souza was not present. We had discussed this and agreed that her presence would shut Brandon down before anything useful could happen. But she was aware of the meeting. She had her own timeline. Brandon arrived 7 minutes late. He walked in with his coat still on and a smile that was doing a lot of work, the practiced, concerned son expression I'd been watching him perform for years. He stopped when he saw the room. The full room. Tom, Diane, Warren, at the head of the table, me, and something moved behind his eyes that he quickly covered. Mom. He came toward me with his arms slightly open, the gesturing of a hug not quite committed to. I'm so relieved you're okay. I've been calling. Sit down, Brandon. He sat. The half-offered hug retracted. He looked around the table again, recalibrating. I thought this was going to be a family conversation, he said. I didn't know Warren was going to be involved. Warren is my attorney, I said. He's involved in everything that has to do with the estate. Right. Brandon nodded slowly, settling into the role of patient, reasonable adult. I had watched him put on that particular performance my whole life. Of course, I wanted to make sure we could talk openly about what's been happening with your health. Tom made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and dismissive, quickly controlled. Brandon glanced at him. Tom, I know this is hard to hear. It's hard for all of us. But there are real concerns about Mom's capacity to... There are no concerns about my capacity, I said. Mom, I'm going to stop you there. I put both hands flat on the table, a habit from 31 years of running meetings with people who needed a clear signal that the floor had shifted. I know what you told Diane. I know what you told Tom. I know what you told Marion Brecht in Ohio, who is 84 years old and did not need your phone call. I watched his face. I know about Dr. Haskell, who does not exist as your physician, or mine. I know about the letter that was sent to Warren's office, and I know about the transfers from my savings account. The practiced expression collapsed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, the full unmasking. Just a collapse, like a structure losing its load-bearing support, settling suddenly into a different shape. Mom, I can explain. $63,000 from the savings account, I said. $22,000 from the home equity line over 11 months. I kept my voice level. I had rehearsed this not to be cruel, but because I knew that if I let emotion run the table, he would find a way to use it. I'm telling you the numbers so you understand that I know them, not some of them, all of them. Silence. The radiator ticked. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and stopped. Brandon looked at Warren. Whatever she's been told, I've told her the truth, Warren said, which is what I've been paid to do for 30 years. Brandon looked at Tom. Tom looked back with the expression of a man who has driven 6 hours from Maryland and is not going to pretend he hasn't. Something shifted in Brandon then. I saw it happen, and I recognized it because I had seen it a handful of times across his life, in arguments that had gone too far, in situations he couldn't charm his way out of. The practiced version of him, the managed, performing version, retreated. What came forward was raw and less careful, and in its own way, more honest. You were going to leave it all to charity, he said. Not a question. His voice had changed, flatter, stripped of the warmth he'd been deploying. I know you, Mom. The way you talk about those scholarship funds, the community programs, you were going to take the whole estate and put it somewhere that had nothing to do with me. I looked at my son. Is that why? Is that your reason? I've spent my whole life being managed by this family. He was looking at the table now, not at me. Dad's money, Dad's estate, Dad's name. I was always the thing that didn't quite fit. You know that. You know how he looked at me. Gerald had reasons for how he looked at you, I said. Reasons you gave him. I needed help. His voice cracked on the last word, and I still don't know, whether that crack was real or one more managed performance. I was in trouble and I needed help and I didn't know how to ask. You could have asked me. I felt something moving in my chest, something that was not sympathy, but was perhaps its precursor. The recognition that underneath the scheme and the cruelty, there was a person I had known since before he had a name. Brandon, you could have come to me and said I'm in trouble. Instead, you fabricated a physician and drained my account and drove me to a mountain road in December and told me to get out of the car. The room was absolutely still. I didn't think you'd... He started. What? Survive? My voice stayed even. I needed it to stay even. Or didn't think I'd remember. Didn't think I'd have the clarity to... I panicked. 2 words, flat and sudden. I panicked, okay? The guardianship wasn't moving forward, and I was out of time, and I panicked. Warren cleared his throat. Brandon, I'd strongly advise you not to say anything further without legal representation present. Brandon looked at Warren, then at me, then at something that wasn't in the room, something I couldn't see. I reached into the folder I had brought and I placed a single document on the table in front of him. He looked down at it. I watched him read the header, Mercer Family Trust, Amendment and Restatement, and then watched his eyes find, partway down the first page, his own name. Or rather, its absence, the blank where it had been. He read for a long moment. "When?" he said. "January 9th, Warren said. Brandon did the math. Before the meeting, before he had arrived here with his assembled story and his careful expressions, the estate had already been restructured. The thing he had driven to the mountains for, the thing he had spent 11 months building toward, had already been moved beyond his reach. He set the document down. He put both hands flat on the table, mirroring me without knowing he was doing it, and he stared at the wood grain. I had expected something at that moment. Relief, maybe. Or the satisfaction that people describe when justice catches up with someone who has acted without conscience. I had expected to feel something proportional. What I felt instead was tired. Deeply, completely tired. The kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep. The kind that accumulates across years of loving someone who takes everything you give and calls it not enough. Warren began walking through the formal record, the amendment, the supporting documentation, the bank's fraud findings that had been provided to his office that morning. He did it carefully and completely, because Warren had been doing this work for 4 decades, and he understood that documentation was protection, and that protection was the only language that held in rooms like this one. Brandon sat through it without speaking. He didn't leave. I had half expected him to stand up and walk out, make some gesture of refusal. Instead, he sat, and he listened, and he looked, at moments, like someone very much younger than 43, like someone who had not thought past the wanting, like someone who had never once asked himself what came after. That, in its way, was the saddest thing I'd ever seen him do. Tom caught my eye from across the table, briefly, with an expression that needed no translation. Diane had her hands folded in her lap, and was looking at Brandon with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the territory between them. When Warren finished, the room was quiet. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" I asked Brandon. I meant it as a real question. I don't know what I was hoping for. Something, maybe. Some acknowledgement that lived closer to the truth than his performances usually got. He looked at me for a long moment. "I always thought you'd leave it to your causes," he said finally, "and I'd get whatever was left." "There were no causes yet," I said. "There was just you. Until there wasn't." He stood up. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He didn't look at Tom or Diane or Warren. He looked at me one more time, and I looked back. And I did not look away. And neither did he. And in that moment, something passed between us that I don't have a clean word for. Not forgiveness, not grief exactly, but maybe the acknowledgement of an ending. The recognition that something that had been one thing for a long time was now, permanently, something else. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The sound of it was quieter than I expected. Warren began gathering his folders. Diane poured herself the cup of coffee she'd been ignoring for an hour. Tom looked at the document still sitting in the center of the table and then looked at me. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we make sure it holds." Making sure it holds turned out to be the work of months. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that is easiest to tell, the version where the documents are signed and the meeting happens and then things resolve themselves into clarity, is not quite the version that actually happened. What actually happened was slower and more wearing and required me to show up repeatedly in rooms where I didn't want to be, saying things I had already said, to people who needed to hear them again. Detective Souza called me the Monday after the family meeting. She had been briefed on what happened in Warren's conference room. She and I had discussed the meeting beforehand, agreed on what could and could not be said in Brandon's presence without compromising the investigation, and she was ready to move to the next stage. "We have enough for a formal interview," she said. "We're bringing him in this week." "Will he cooperate?" "He'll have an attorney by then. Whether that attorney tells him to cooperate is a different question." A brief pause. "I want you to know that the charge picture is still developing. We have the fraud, the identity appropriation. The Haskell documentation alone is significant. The mountain road is harder. Harder how? Abandonment of a dependent adult is a charge that requires specific elements. His attorney is going to argue you're not legally a dependent adult, that the mountain road was a disagreement, that you got out of the car voluntarily. I sat with that for a moment. The particular nausea of hearing your own experience legally reframed into something almost unrecognizable. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything you remember, in as much detail as you can give me. What he said, the exact words if you can recall them, the sequence, how long you walked before Cole found you. Everything." I had already given her a statement at the county office. I gave her another one, in her office this time, sitting across from her at a table with a recorder between us and a legal pad in front of her that she filled steadily as I talked. I talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, my voice was hoarse, and I was tired in the specific way of someone who has excavated something that was buried and finds the excavation more exhausting than the burial. "You did well," Sousa said, clicking off the recorder. "I'm not trying to do well," I said. "I'm trying to tell the truth." She looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of someone whose work involves other people's worst moments and who has learned to sit in those moments without flinching. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." Brandon was interviewed on a Thursday. I know this because Sousa called me Friday morning to tell me how it had gone, in the careful, measured way she had of sharing information without sharing more than was appropriate. "He denied the mountain road," she said. "Says you asked to stop the car. Says you got out on your own and he thought you were upset and needed a moment, and when he came back you were gone." I breathed through the initial wave of that. He came back. That's what he says. How long had I been gone by then, in his version? He says 15, 20 minutes. Cole found me 45 minutes after I got out of the car. I had walked nearly a mile. I kept my voice even. The direction I was walking was away from the direction Brandon would have driven back from. If he came back, he didn't look very hard. "I know," Sousa said. "We know. Cole's report is time-stamped. The clinic intake is time-stamped. His story has problems, and we're building the record around those problems." She paused. "He admitted to the financial transfers." That surprised me. He admitted it. His attorney advised him to get ahead of it. They're framing it as a loan. That you had agreed to lend him the money, and he was keeping informal records. They have a document, apparently. Handwritten. Purportedly your signature. Another signature. I felt a cold, familiar anger settle in my chest. "Send it to the document examiner," I said. "Already did." The examiner's report came back in 11 days. The signature on Brandon's handwritten loan document did not match my authenticated signatures across 3 decades of legal and financial paperwork. It was closer than the home equity line forgery, close enough that it took the examiner longer to render an opinion, but it was not mine. Sousa called me when she had the report. Her voice, when she delivered that news, had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Not celebration. She was too professional for celebration. But something like the satisfaction of a structure becoming sound. "We're looking at filing charges within the next 30 days, she said. "Wire fraud, identity theft, financial exploitation of an older adult, and forgery. 4 counts on the forgery alone. The mountain road." She hesitated. "We're still building that, but the financial case is solid." I thanked her and sat in my kitchen for a long while after the call. The afternoon light was doing what it does in late February, thin and pale, coming in low through the west window in a way that lit the dust on the countertop and the scratches on the kitchen table and every ordinary, imperfect thing in the room with a kind of unsparing clarity. I had not heard from Brandon since the meeting. Not a call, not a message. Either his attorney had told him not to contact me, or he had decided on his own that there was nothing left to say. Both were plausible. Both represented, in their own way, a boundary finally in place that should have been in place years ago. The fact that it had taken a criminal investigation to install it was something I was still coming to terms with. There were people, in those weeks, who wanted me to talk about it in terms of forgiveness. A neighbor. A woman from my old school community who had heard something and called to offer support in the halting, well-meaning way of people who are not sure what to say but feel they should say something. She asked me, twice in the same conversation, whether I was considering making peace with what had happened. "I have peace," I told her. It's not the kind that requires making peace with someone else. She didn't quite understand that, I could tell, but it was true. Peace, I had learned, was not a transaction. It was not something you achieved by extending yourself toward the person who hurt you and hoping they met you halfway. Sometimes it was something you built from the ground up in the interior of your own life, with the doors locked and the materials you actually had on hand. I was building it, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks I didn't announce to anyone. There were nights I woke up and lay in the dark of my own bedroom and felt the full weight of what had been done, and it was heavy enough that I had to remind myself, deliberately, that I was here, that I had walked a mile in that storm, that I had survived what he had planned, and I was still, despite everything, in the house I had built with Gerald, in the bed I had slept in for 30 years, with the heat on and the locks changed, and my name still on the deed. March came in the way March does in Pennsylvania, uncertain, neither committed to winter nor willing to fully release it. There were days of genuine thaw, followed by days of cold that felt personal, felt like the season making a point. I drove myself most days. My knee was better, not all the way better. I suspected it would always remind me of that logging road, which was its own kind of documentation, but functional. I could drive. I went to see Marion in Ohio. I had been thinking about that drive for weeks. Marion had been used, and the using of her had been a small piece of a larger scheme, and I understood that she had no capacity to understand what had happened or what her small acquiescence had been part of. She was 84 years old, and she had been lied to by someone she assumed was calling in good faith. That was not Marion's failure. That was Brandon's. But I wanted to see her. I wanted to sit in her kitchen and drink the too sweet coffee she made and hear about her garden, which she planned obsessively through the winter months, even though she could no longer tend it herself. And I wanted her to see me, clearly, fully present, the same woman she'd been sending Christmas cookies to for 20 years, declining in no way that mattered. Diane drove me. 7 hours round trip. She brought a book and sat in Marion's living room reading it while Marion and I sat at the kitchen table, and Marion cried a little when she saw me, the way very old people sometimes cry when they see someone they weren't sure they'd see again, and I held her hand and told her she had done nothing wrong and that I was fine. "He sounded so worried," Marion said. "He called me twice. He sounded like a good son." "I know. I should have called you. I should have—" "Marion." I squeezed her hand. "There's no version of this where you're at fault. Do you understand me?" She looked at me with her red-rimmed eyes and nodded, not entirely convinced. I knew she would carry some version of it regardless, the way old people carry things, quietly, privately, without burdening anyone with it. I couldn't fix that. I could only have sat with her, which I did, for 2 hours, over too sweet coffee and a plate of shortbread she'd made from the recipe I knew by heart. When we left, Diane asked me how I was. "I'm all right," I said. And then, because Diane had driven me 7 hours and earned more than a rote answer, it makes me angry all over again every time I see another person he used. And then the anger goes somewhere else and I just feel tired of it, tired of how much space it takes up. Diane was quiet for a mile or two, then, "It doesn't have to take up space forever." "I know that." "I'm not sure you do yet," she said gently, "but you will." The formal charges were filed on April 2nd. Sousa called me that morning, and I wrote down each charge as she read them. Wire fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery in the first degree, identity theft, and, she said this last one carefully, with a specific emphasis, reckless endangerment resulting in physical harm. They had found the right charge for the mountain road. Not the maximum possible, not the charge I might have chosen if I were the one filing, but a charge that fit the documented facts. The weather conditions, Cole's report, the clinic intake, my medical records showing cold exposure and early frostbite in a way that would hold under challenge. "He's being arraigned this afternoon," Sousa said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it was public. Thank you. Evelyn." She used my first name, which she rarely did. "You handled this right, every step, the documentation, the statement, the meeting, all of it gave us something to work with. I want you to know that." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I had spent 43 years making every possible wrong decision about Brandon Hale, and that handling something right, finally, in what might be the last chapter of our story, felt less like triumph than like arriving somewhere I should have been much sooner. Instead, I thanked her, and we said goodbye, and I sat in my kitchen and let the news settle into the room. The bank had begun the process of recovering the transferred funds the previous month. It was slow. These things were always slow, Warren had warned me, especially when some of the money had already moved through other accounts, which Brandon's had. They had recovered 41 of the 63,000 from the savings account. The home equity line was more complicated and would take longer. There was a possibility, Warren said, that some of it would not be recoverable, that it had been spent on things that were already gone. That was a hard thing to accept, and I accepted it anyway, the way you accept the parts of a situation you cannot change when you've spent your energy on the parts you can. I had the estate, I had the house, I had the trust, restructured, protected, with my name as sole trustee and a corporate co-trustee. Warren had engaged, solid and unhackable in the way that proper legal architecture is when built by someone who knows what they're doing. I had rebuilt the floor. What was lost into it, I let go. There was a hearing in May that I attended. I did not have to. It was a pre-trial motion, procedural, nothing that required my presence. But I wanted to be there. I wanted to sit in that room and be visible and real, the way you are visible and real when you are not deceased, which was what Brandon had counted on when he drove up that mountain road. Brandon was there with his attorney. He looked worse than he had at the family meeting, thinner, with the particular pallor of someone who has not been sleeping, who has been living inside the consequences of decisions they can no longer undo. He did not look at me when I came in. He looked at the table, at his attorney, at the judge's bench, not at me. I had expected to feel something specific in that room, victory, maybe, or its more mature cousin, vindication. What I felt instead was complicated and hard to name and not very satisfying. Something closer to the feeling you get when you've finished a very long, very difficult piece of work. Not happiness, exactly, but a kind of completion. The sense that something that needed doing has been done. His attorney filed a motion to suppress some of the financial records on technical grounds. The judge denied it in under 4 minutes, which Sousa had told me was essentially unheard of, and which Warren later described, with satisfaction, as a very bad sign for Brandon's prospects. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Diane and Tom were waiting. Tom had driven up from Maryland again. He was becoming a more consistent presence in my life than he had been in decades, which was one of the things I had not anticipated and which meant more than I knew how to say. "Well?" Tom said. "Motion denied," I said. "We go to trial in the fall." Tom nodded. He looked out at the parking lot and then back at me. "Gerald would have been—" He stopped. "I know," I said. "He would have been furious," Tom said. "Not at you, at himself, for not making this harder to do." I had thought about Gerald a great deal in those months, about what he had seen in Brandon that I had refused to see, about the warning in the kitchen the year before he died. I had spent a lot of time being angry at myself for not listening, and then I had spent some time recognizing that I had loved my husband and my son simultaneously, and that those two loves had asked contradictory things of me, and I had not known, back then, how to honor both. I was not entirely free of regret about it. I didn't think I would be. But I had stopped treating the regret as evidence of my failure and started treating it as evidence that I was paying attention, finally, to things that deserved attention. "Gerald knew what he saw," I said to Tom. "He just didn't know what to do with it any more than I did." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you do now?" It was the same question he'd asked at the end of the family meeting. Now, 2 months later, I had a better answer. "I go home," I said, "and I keep building." He nodded. Diane was already moving toward the car, keys in hand, and I followed, and the courthouse door closed behind us, and the May air was cool and real and entirely present. The things that came to light in those months were not only about Brandon. Some of them were about me. I discovered, going through Gerald's papers more carefully than I had since his death, a letter he had written and never sent. It was in a file folder marked, in his handwriting, simply personal, which I had passed over twice during earlier reviews of his desk because I had assumed it contained medical records or insurance documents or something equally utilitarian. It didn't. It was a letter addressed to Brandon. 4 pages, handwritten, dated 8 months before Gerald died. It was not a kind letter. It was not a cruel one either. It was, in the way Gerald was capable of, at his most direct, an honest one. He wrote about the money he'd lent Brandon over the years, more than I had known about, I discovered. Gerald had made several loans to Brandon without telling me, not to keep secrets, but because he'd hoped, Gerald wrote, to handle it without upsetting me, and had realized only too late that hope was not a strategy. He wrote about what he'd seen in Brandon as a businessman, as a son, as a person who related to other people primarily through what those people could offer him. He wrote it without sentimentality and without cruelty. And then, toward the end, he wrote this. I don't know what you'll become. I've stopped trying to predict it. What I know is that your mother loves you in a way I've never fully understood because it persists past every reason it probably shouldn't. I've been angry about that at times. Lately, I'm something closer to awed by it. But I need you to understand, and this is the only thing in this letter that I need you to understand, that her love for you does not obligate her to sacrifice herself for you. It never did. And if you ever use her love as a tool against her, I will consider that the worst thing you have ever done, and I will not be able to forgive it wherever I am. I read that paragraph several times. I sat with it for a long time. Gerald had known. He had known with more specificity than his kitchen warning had suggested, and he had written it down 8 months before he died, in a letter he never sent because maybe he'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, or maybe he'd lost his nerve, or maybe he'd decided that some things you write down not to send, but to have written. To have said, even privately, to have named. I kept the letter. I put it in the file with the trust documents and the bank fraud records, and Cole's original incident report and Warren's amendment, all the paperwork of the worst year of my life. And I closed the folder. Then I went and made myself dinner. Something simple. Eggs, toast, the last of a soup I'd made earlier in the week. I ate at the kitchen table, alone, in the house that was still mine, and outside the May evening was going from gold to gray in the way it does in Pennsylvania at that time of year, the long, slow, beautiful decay of a spring day. And I ate my eggs, and I did not cry, and I did not feel sorry for myself, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt, with a clarity I had not had in years, exactly where I was. And where I was here, alive, clear-eyed, still standing. For now, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The trial was set for the 2nd week of October. I want to tell you that I walked into that courthouse calm and unafraid, that the months of preparation had sealed me against whatever that day could throw at me. But that would not be true. And I have spent enough of my life telling comfortable untruths about hard things. The morning of the first day, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself go in. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard, not as a way of measuring time, but as something to fix my eyes on while I managed my breathing. The tree outside the parking lot had gone full October, that particular red that Pennsylvania maples do, the color that looks almost violent against a gray sky. I sat and looked at it and thought about December, about a different kind of tree, birches with ice on their branches catching headlights and throwing it back, about how far I had come from that road. Then I got out of the car. Warren was waiting on the courthouse steps with a younger colleague he'd brought to assist, a woman named Priya who was sharp and prepared and said little, which I appreciated. Diane was there. Tom had driven up again, which by then had stopped surprising me. Sousa was inside already, moving through the business of the day with her usual economy of motion and expression. Brandon was there with his attorney, a man I had never met who had the particular air of someone accustomed to difficult clients and long odds. Brandon was in a suit I didn't recognize, new or borrowed or purchased specifically for this. He was thinner still than he'd been in May. When he came through the door and we were briefly in the same space, the same corridor, he looked at me for one long second. He looked, I thought, like someone who had finally stopped performing and was left with only what was actually there, which was not much. I did not look away. I also did not say anything. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in Warren's conference room in February, And words in courthouse corridors have a way of becoming things other than what you intended. I let the look be what it was. Two people who had been connected since before he had a name, seeing each other clearly, possibly for the first time. And then I walked past him toward the courtroom. The trial lasted 4 days. I will not walk you through every hour of it, because most of those hours were procedural and technical, the machinery of the legal process doing what it does with a thoroughness that is both reassuring and exhausting. I will tell you what mattered. On the second day, the prosecution entered the financial records. All of them. The bank transfer logs, the home equity line documentation with the forged signature, the fabricated Dr. Haskell correspondence that had been sent to Warren's office, the text messages to Diane and Tom and Marion. The document examiner testified about the signatures. The bank's fraud investigator testified about the transfer pattern. Renata, the fraud specialist I had spoken to on the phone in December, testified in person. She was younger than I had imagined from her voice, early 30s, methodical and precise on the stand. On the third day, Cole testified. He described finding me on that mountain road in terms so specific and so quiet that the courtroom, which had been running at a low ambient level of noise throughout the proceedings, went completely still. He described the temperature. He described what I looked like when his headlights hit me. He described my hands. I had not known, until he said it on the stand, that when he'd helped me to the truck, my hands had been bleeding. I had caught myself on something in the dark. A branch, a wire fence, I still don't know, and hadn't felt it, because cold hands don't register pain the way they should. Cole had wrapped them in a cloth from his emergency kit. He still had the cloth, he said. He had kept it, logged it. It was entered into evidence. I sat in that courtroom and listened to a 29-year-old man describe the cloth he had used to wrap my bleeding hands in the cold, and I had to work very hard to stay where I was and not go somewhere else inside my own head. Brandon's attorney made the argument they had telegraphed from the beginning, that the financial transfers were loans made with my knowledge and informal agreement, that the mountain road was a misunderstanding that had escalated, that I had chosen to exit the vehicle. He said the word chosen with a particular emphasis, as if the act of my survival negated the intent behind the situation that had necessitated it, as if getting out of a car that has been stopped in a deliberate place, in deliberate weather, by someone who has spent a year building toward your removal from your own life, was simply a choice made in the ordinary sense of the word. Sousa's team had anticipated this. On the fourth day, they called their final witness, Sandra, Brandon's first ex-wife, Lily's mother. I had not known she was going to testify. Sousa had kept that close, and I understood why. If I had known, I would have worried about it, about what it would cost Sandra, about whether it was fair to pull her into this. But Sandra had apparently come forward on her own. Sousa told me this afterward. Sandra had contacted the prosecutor's office in August and offered a statement. She testified for 40 minutes. She described the marriage, not comprehensively, not as an airing of grievances, but specifically and on point. She described financial behavior. She described a pattern of moving money in ways that weren't traceable, of claiming loans that the other party had no memory of agreeing to, of constructing narratives after the fact that reframed his decisions as other people's choices. She described one specific incident near the end of their marriage, in which Brandon had told her that his parents were planning to cut him out of their will and that he needed to get ahead of it before it was too late. She said it without drama. She said it the way someone says something they have been carrying for a long time and have finally been asked to put down. Her voice didn't shake. She looked at the jury when she spoke, not at Brandon and not at me. I looked at her, though. I looked at her and I thought about what it cost a person to walk into a room like that and say true things about someone they had once loved, someone who was the father of their child. And I thought about Lily, who talked about me after visits, who had Gerald's eyes, who would grow up inside whatever shape this story finally took. Brandon looked at the table while Sandra testified. He did not look up once. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. I know this because I tracked it the way you track something you cannot influence but cannot stop watching, compulsively, uselessly, checking my phone every 20 minutes for the call from Warren that would tell me it was done. It came on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October while I was in my garden. I had started working in the garden that fall in a serious way for the first time since Gerald died. Not because I had become a different person, but because I had discovered somewhere in the long, strange year behind me that putting my hands in the ground and growing things was the one activity that reliably returned me to myself. My neighbor Ruth, who had been one of the people Brandon had contacted, who had since appeared at my door with a casserole and a long apology that I had received as gracefully as I could manage, had given me 3 rose cuttings in September. I was getting them established before the first hard frost. My phone rang, and I picked it up with dirty gloves still on my hands. "Guilty," Warren said. "All counts." I sat down on the garden bench. My gloves left prints on the wood. "All of them?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "All of them, Evelyn. Wire fraud, financial exploitation, forgery, 4 counts, identity theft, and reckless endangerment. The jury came back on every single charge." I looked at the garden. The roses, still new and uncertain in their soil. The late October light on everything. The sky, the particular deep blue that comes just before the cold finally wins. "Thank you, Warren," I said. "Don't thank me. This was you. Every piece of documentation, every decision you made from the night Cole found you, this was your work." I didn't argue with him. I let him have the generosity of the statement, and I sat in my garden, and I let it be finished. What? Sentencing was in December. Brandon received 4 years, with the possibility of early release at 2 if he met the program conditions. The financial restitution order required him to repay what had been taken, the full amount, not just what the bank had already recovered. Warren said enforcing restitution orders was its own long process, and I should not expect a check to arrive. I told him I understood, and I meant it. The money mattered less by then than the record. The permanent, legal, unchallengeable record of what had been done and who had done it. I was not in the courtroom for sentencing. I had chosen not to be, and I want to explain that choice because I think it mattered. I had been asked if I wanted to deliver a victim impact statement, and I had spent 2 weeks deciding, and in the end I said no. Not because I didn't have things to say. I had, if anything, too many. But I had already said the true and necessary things in every room that mattered, to Sousa, to Warren, to the jury through their testimony. Adding one more statement in one more room felt like it would be for me, rather than for any purpose the situation actually required. And I had spent enough of my life doing things for the wrong reasons. I was trying to stop. What I did on the morning of Brandon's sentencing was drive to Sandra's house. She had texted me in October, the day after the verdict, a single brief message. "I hope this gives you some peace." I had replied that it did, and I had meant to say more, and I hadn't, because some things require a conversation and not a text. So I drove to her house, which was 40 minutes from mine, a small yellow house on a street with old trees, and I knocked on the door. Lily opened it. She was in the middle of something. Her hair was pulled back unevenly. She had what looked like paint on one hand, and she was wearing mismatched socks, which was entirely consistent with the girl I knew. She looked up at me, and her face did the thing that children's faces do when they see someone unexpected but welcome. That rapid, uncalculated brightening. "Grandma Evelyn." Not Grandma. Grandma Evelyn. She had always made that distinction, precise and particular, as if she wanted me to know exactly which grandmother she meant. "Can I come in?" I asked. She stepped back and held the door wide. Sandra came in from the kitchen, and we sat at her table, the 3 of us, and had coffee. Real coffee for Sandra and me, hot chocolate for Lily, who sat with us rather than going back to whatever she'd been doing, which I noted and filed in the category of things that matter without requiring comment. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the trial, not about Brandon, about Lily's school, about a project Sandra was doing at her job, about the roses I was attempting and my lack of confidence in my ability to keep them alive through winter. "You kept yourself alive through a blizzard," Sandra said. "I think you can manage roses." I laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise. Lily looked up from her hot chocolate with an expression of satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for exactly that sound. When I left, Lily walked me to my car. She had put on shoes, though not a coat, because she was 9 and 9-year-olds have a particular conviction that the rules of temperature don't fully apply to them. "Are you okay?" she asked. It was such a direct question, the way children's questions are direct, without the hedging that adults learn. Getting better, I said. Are you okay? She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to things. I think so. Mom says things are going to be different now. She says that's not always bad. Your mom is right, I said. Lily nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she hugged me. Fast, tight, the way children hug when they mean it and don't want to make a production of it, and went back inside. I sat in the car for a moment before starting it. Not because I was struggling, just because I wanted to hold it for a second, that moment. The yellow house, the old trees, the girl with paint on her hand, and Gerald's eyes, who was going to grow up into whatever she was going to grow up into, and who had, at some point in her 9 years, decided that I was a person worth walking outside without a coat for. I started the car and drove home. But I want to talk to you now. Not as Evelyn, not in the voice of the story. I want to talk to you directly, the way I wish someone had talked to me 20 years ago, when the patterns that led to that mountain road were still forming, when there was still time to interrupt them. Because if you have listened to this story all the way to the end, I think you already know that it is not really about Brandon. Brandon is a symptom. The disease is something older and quieter and much more common, and it lives in the space between loving someone and losing yourself in that love. I love my son. I want to be clear about that, because I don't think the love was the mistake. The love was real. The mistake was in believing that real love required me to absorb everything he did to me without naming it, without protecting myself, without holding a line. The mistake was in treating my own needs, my financial security, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life and estate without interference, as things that were somehow less important than keeping a peace that was never real anyway. Here's what I know now that I did not know then. Love does not cancel out harm. A person can love you and harm you simultaneously, and the love does not make the harm less real. When someone consistently takes from you, your money, your autonomy, your sense of reality, the fact that you love them does not obligate you to keep offering more. That is not love sustaining itself. That is love being used as a mechanism. And there is a difference, even when it is painful to see it. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal. I spent years feeling that if I put limits on what Brandon could ask of me, I was failing him as a mother. I now understand that the opposite was true. Every time I absorbed something I should have named, every time I made an excuse when I should have drawn a line, I was not protecting him. I was protecting a version of myself that I could keep comfortable. I was avoiding the confrontation that might have, years earlier, forced us both toward a different story. Protection is not softness. Sometimes protection is the hardest possible thing. Your resources, what you have built, what you have earned, what you have saved across a lifetime of careful and sometimes difficult choices, belong to you. Not to the people who expect to inherit them. Not to the people who feel entitled to them because of blood or history or the mere fact of their need. You have the right to decide what happens to what you have built. You have the right to change those decisions if the circumstances change. You have the right to protect what is yours from people who would take it by force or by fraud or by the slow, patient erosion of your confidence in your own mind. If someone is telling you that you are confused, that you are forgetting things, that your judgment can no longer be trusted, and they are the only source of that assessment, and they stand to benefit from your believing it, please hear me when I say that is not care. That is control wearing the costume of care. Seek a second opinion. And a third, trust the people who have nothing to gain from your dependence. I know some of you listening to this are older women living alone, the way I was living alone. I know some of you have adult children who are struggling, who come to you with needs that feel urgent and real and that pull on everything you feel as a parent. I'm not telling you to close your door. I'm telling you to keep your eyes open while it is open. Know what you have. Know where it is. Know who has access. Have an attorney you trust, documents that are current, and at least one person in your life, a Diane, a Tom, a Cole, who will answer the phone when you call from a borrowed number in a hospital room. Because here is the thing no one tells you about being strong. It is not the same as being invulnerable. I walked a mile in that blizzard. I signed the documents and sat through the trial and did not break. And I also cried in a clinic in the mountains while a nurse named Pamela, wrapped me in foil, and checked my temperature. Both of those things are true at the same time. Strength is not the absence of need. It is what you do with need when it arrives. The following spring, Warren finalized the charitable structure I had been working on since January. The Mercer Educational Foundation, Gerald's name, my design, established its first round of scholarships in May. 6 recipients. 6 young people from the county where I had spent 31 years as a principal, chosen by a committee that included 2 of my former teachers, a community leader Diane had recommended, and at my specific request, Ruth from next door, who had once accepted Brandon's story about me without question, and who I had decided deserved the chance to do better, and who had been doing better, consistently, ever since. The scholarship ceremony was held at the high school where I had served the longest, in the gymnasium that still had the same slightly uneven floor it had when I arrived there in 1991, and which the district had been promising to fix for 30 years. Folding chairs, a podium with a microphone that fed back twice, the kind of event that is imperfect in every logistical detail and exactly right in every other way. I sat in the front row next to Diane and watched 6 young people walk across that floor to accept something that would change what was possible for them. They were nervous, the way young people are nervous when they are being seen. They shook hands with the committee members and held their certificates and squinted into the gymnasium lights. And a few of them looked genuinely stunned, the way people look when something good happens that they hadn't fully let themselves expect. I had written each of them a letter, personal, not form letters. I had sat at my kitchen table for 3 evenings and written 6 separate letters to 6 people I had only read about in application files because I wanted them to know that the person behind the scholarship was a real person who had read their words and been moved by them. I don't know if those letters meant anything. I hope they did. But I wrote them for the writing of them as much as for the receiving, because I had learned in the year behind me that the acts that anchor you to the person you want to be are worth doing regardless of whether anyone sees them. Tom came to the ceremony. He sat beside Diane with his hands on his knees and looked at those 6 young people with an expression I recognized as Gerald's, that particular quiet pride that didn't need to announce itself. He would have loved this, Tom said, when it was over. We were standing in the parking lot, the May evening going gold around us. He paid for it, I said. In a way. Tom smiled at that. He'd say you paid for it. We both did, I said. That's what 32 years means. There was a reception afterward in the school library. I stood for 2 hours and talked to people and ate bad punch and excellent cookies that one of the scholarship recipients' mothers had brought, and I was tired by the end of it in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. When I finally got to my car, I sat for a moment in the quiet of it, the noise of the reception still faintly audible through the closed windows. I thought about December. The parking lot behind the school was adjacent to the athletic fields, and beyond the fields were the hills, and beyond the hills, somewhere north and east, were mountains. The same mountains. The same roads winding up through the same trees that had ice on their branches that night, that had been dark and close and indifferent while I walked through the storm looking for a light. I was not afraid of the mountains. I want you to know that. Fear of the place would have been understandable, reasonable, and I did not feel it. What I felt, sitting in the school parking lot with the reception still going inside, was something I don't have a precise word for. A kind of accounting. A tallying up of what the year had cost and what it had built, and what those 2 things meant together. What it cost, $63,000, some of which was recovered and some of which was not. One knee that still ached in cold weather. The last version of my son I had tried to believe in. Years, I will not pretend otherwise, to years that I spent loving someone who was in the process of building the tools he would eventually use against me, and not seeing it. What it built. A trust that held. An estate protected. A foundation with 6 recipients and a committee and a scholarship ceremony in a gymnasium with a crooked floor. Lily's education, secured regardless of anything else. Sandra, who had walked into a courtroom and said true things. Tom, driving from Maryland. Diane, answering the phone. Cole, stopping a truck on a mountain road in a storm because someone was waving her arms. The network of people who showed up. That was what it built. Not by design. I had not orchestrated those relationships, had not planned for Cole or Sandra or Renata at the bank. They had appeared because I had been willing to tell the truth about what happened. And truth, when you tell it clearly, has a way of calling people toward it. I started the car. The roads home were familiar and well lit, nothing like what they had been in December, and I drove them with the window cracked because the evening was warm enough and I wanted the air. Here is the last thing I want to say to you, and I mean it as directly as I can say anything. The person who wants to take what is yours is counting on your hesitation. They are counting on your love, your loyalty, your belief that family is the one thing that holds regardless. They are counting on the version of you that would rather absorb the harm quietly than cause a disruption that feels like disloyalty. They are counting on you not knowing your own worth. Know your worth. Not the worth that other people assign to you. Not the worth that requires you to keep giving past the point of reason in order to justify being loved. The worth that exists independent of anyone else's assessment of it. The worth that walked a mile in a blizzard and signed the documents and sat through 4 days of trial and planted roses in October and wrote 6 letters to 6 strangers and showed up every time because showing up was the thing that was required. Gerald saw it. Cole saw it. Diane and Tom and Sandra saw it. The jury saw it. And somewhere in this year, somewhere between that logging road and this parking lot, I finally, fully saw it in myself. I am 68 years old. I have a house that is mine and an estate that holds and a foundation that will outlast me. I have a 9-year-old girl with Gerald's eyes who called me Grandma Evelyn and hugged me in a front yard without a coat. I have a knee that reminds me, in the cold, that I survived something that was meant to be unsurvivable. I have more years ahead of me and I intend to use them, not for anyone who would take them from me, for the people who show up, for the young people with their certificates and their stunned faces in gymnasium lights, for the version of myself that Gerald saw and that I am still, every day, still learning to trust. That is the legacy I am building, and it is mine.